Hello, Namaskar. This is First Post and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. It's day 11 of the war. 9 p.m. in India, 6:30 p.m. in Israel, hours to go for US President Joe Biden to land. He will meet leaders of Israel, Jordan, Egypt and Palestine. The US has put 2,000 soldiers on standby in case the war escalates. In Gaza, the death toll continues to rise. Among them is a senior commander of Hamas. As the crisis escalates, Iran is threatening to join the war. What will that mean for the region? Also, does Iran have the appetite for a direct war right now? Meanwhile, Netanyahu's ratings are sinking, especially as the wait for Israeli hostages continues. Today, Hamas released a video of a woman they've held captive. We'll show it to you. Also discuss the role of Egypt. From a peace broker in the past to almost a jailer now, why does Egypt refuse to take civilians from Gaza? Which countries are supporting Hamas and why? The list includes Malaysia, South Africa and Colombia. Why are Western campuses soft on Hamas? And why conflating terrorism with resistance is dangerous. Also, Vladimir Putin is in China and India has stopped short of legalizing same-sex marriage. We'll bring you all this and more. The headlines first. The Israeli currency, the shekel, drops to an 8-year low against the US dollar. The shekel has lost more than 3% since the war began last week. The Bank of Israel has unveiled a $45 billion package to moderate the shekel's volatility. The West builds pressure on Iran. The European Union will not lift nuclear deal sanctions on Iran. Tehran has called this move illegal. This is beyond the deadline mentioned in the 2015 deal aimed at curbing Iran's nuclear program. Russian President Vladimir Putin meets Hungary's Viktor Orban in China. The Hungarian Prime Minister is Putin's closest ally in the European Union. Hungary, which borders Ukraine, has opposed many EU initiatives that support Kiev in the war against Moscow. Liberia is heading for a presidential runoff. The first round was a close fight between incumbent George Weah and Joseph Boakai. In 2018, the United Nations ended its peacekeeping mission in the West African country. This is the first poll to be held since then. Liberia is Africa's oldest republic. And Greece is worried over its ticking demographic time bomb. Its prime minister declares quote-unquote national danger over the declining birth rate. By 2050, the population is likely to fall by over 1 million. Last year, there were fewer than 77,000 births, the lowest in 90 years. It's day 11 of the Israel-Hamas war, and the big headline is this. US President Joe Biden is traveling to Israel. It's a rare and risky visit because American presidents do not visit war zones. Not when American soldiers are not fighting there. But Biden is doing just that. He will land in Tel Aviv on Wednesday. He will hold talks with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and then he will fly to Jordan. So what is Biden's mission in West Asia? What message is he trying to send? Biden's top diplomat, Antony Blinken, highlighted 5 goals. Listen to this.
First, the President will reaffirm the United States' solidarity with Israel and our ironclad commitment to its security. Second, President Biden will underscore our crystal clear message to any actor, state or non-state, trying to take advantage of this crisis to attack Israel. Third, the President will continue to coordinate closely with our Israeli partners to secure the release of hostages taken by Hamas. Fourth, President Biden will receive a comprehensive brief on Israel's war aims and strategy. Fifth, the President will hear from Israel how it will conduct its operations in a way that minimizes civilian casualties.
Two of those stand out. One is to show support for Israel. Biden has not been the best of friends with Netanyahu, so this visit is his way of saying none of that matters. None of what happened in the past matters. America has Israel's back. And second, to send a message to Israel's enemies. Iran has been cranking up the rhetoric. They're threatening to unleash their proxies on Israel. So Biden's visit is about two main things: solidarity and resolve. He's putting 2,000 American soldiers on standby. The Pentagon calls it prepare to deploy. These 2,000 soldiers can enter the action in 24 hours. And what will they do? Well, they're not combat troops. Their job is not to join Israel's fight against Hamas. Their job is to support them. Things like advising, medical support, handling explosives, and all of that. So it's symbolic and significant. It shows Washington is preparing for Israel's ground invasion of Gaza. They know it's coming, so they want to be ready. Biden's visit was set up after multiple rounds of diplomacy, and Antony Blinken was leading that effort. He returned to Israel on Monday after visiting Arab capitals. He held a marathon meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It lasted for nearly 8 hours, an 8-hour-long meeting. At one point, the talks were disrupted by air raid sirens. Both Netanyahu and Blinken were rushed into a bunker. Nonetheless, their talks continued. Reports say the focus was on the ground invasion. Now just take a look at these pictures. These are from outside the Gaza border. Israel has amassed more tanks and equipment overnight. If they enter Gaza, it will be a bloodbath. And the Americans know this. If more Gazans die, the sentiments will change. The Arab countries could toughen their stance. Iran could plot attacks to the north. So Washington is hoping for damage control here. An invasion with limited casualties, that's their best hope. And how did they achieve that? With evacuations and air corridors. That's what Blinken discussed with Netanyahu. He later said Israel had agreed to a plan on delivering aid. He did not explain the plan, but on the ground there is some movement. Some 160 aid trucks are heading towards the Rafah crossing. We told you about this yesterday, the Rafah crossing. It is a crossing between Egypt and Gaza. And right now it's their only hope, the only way of getting aid into Gaza. Even if Rafah, but even Rafah is not off limits right now. Look at the scenes there this morning. Israeli rockets targeted the city. People there woke up to death and destruction.
At 3:30 in the morning, we woke up and saw the whole area in ruins. 3 missiles hit, 2 exploded, and 1 is still inside the building. We pulled out the remains of civilians. They were all civilians. There were no militants and nothing related to military activities. Our region is known for hosting civilians and poor people only. Look here and there. Around 7 floors are gone.
So the situation in Gaza is getting worse. Israel imposed a complete siege there last week. There is no water, power, or food. Over the weekend, Israel had asked people to evacuate northern Gaza, but tens of thousands still remain. In Gaza City, for example, there are some 100,000 people. 1 lakh people. These are civilians, including children. Any moment could be their last because the air raids continue. Israel struck multiple Hamas targets overnight. Buildings near the Jabalia refugee camp were targeted. People were seen digging through the rubble. Many survivors are trapped underneath, and bodies too. Reports say around 1,000 dead bodies are buried under the rubble. There is no way to retrieve them. And remember, all this is before the ground offensive. You can imagine the toll once Israeli soldiers enter Gaza. Hence the focus on aid and evacuations. The West is hoping that Egypt and Jordan will take some refugees, but both these countries have refused. They will send aid, but they will not take people. The Jordanian king is in Berlin today. He met with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He said West Asia is on the brink of the abyss. Meanwhile, Olaf Scholz issued a warning to Iran and Hezbollah.
No refugees in Jordan, no refugees in Egypt. This is a situation of humanitarian dimension that has to be dealt inside of Gaza and the West Bank, and not to try and push the Palestinian challenge and their future onto other people's shoulders.
Once again, I expressly warn Hezbollah and Iran not to intervene in this conflict. Together with our allies, we as the federal government are doing everything in our power to ensure that this conflict does not escalate further.
Scholz is planning a trip to Israel. He's expected to arrive sometime this week. His warning to Iran is a reminder of how bad things could get, how this could very much become a much bigger war. That's our next story. Israel has many foes, but one ranks above everyone else, both in terms of hatred and capabilities, and that is Iran. From day one, Iran has been involved in this war. They reportedly plotted the Hamas attack. They're also behind the escalation in Lebanon, and now Tehran has issued a new threat. It has come from their supreme leader himself. This is what he said.
If these crimes continue, the Muslims will become impatient. The resistance forces will become impatient, and no one will be able to stop them. Israel and the West should know this. Don't expect others to let such groups do such things. No one can stop them when they get impatient.
And who are these resistance groups? Probably Iran's proxies in West Asia. Their foreign minister also hinted at the possibility. He talked about preemptive strikes on Israel, which makes you wonder, how serious is this threat from Iran? Is it just rhetoric? Or is Tehran willing to walk the talk? First, some background. Israel and Iran were not always enemies. In fact, they were friends until 1979. The Shah of Iran called it a secret love affair. All that changed after the Iranian Revolution. The new regime called Israel the Little Satan, the great Satan being the US. And thus began the Israel-Iran shadow war. Both countries are located more than 1,000 kilometers away. They do not even share a border, yet they are sworn enemies. Iran's Ayatollah was all praises for the Hamas terrorists who attacked Israel. He said he would kiss their hands. And since then, Tehran has consistently warned of an escalation, of a wider war. But what does this threat mean? Will Iranian soldiers fight against Israel? It looks highly unlikely right now, but Iranian proxies could enter the fight. These are armed groups spread across West Asia. They're funded and supported by Iran, and in return, they do Tehran's bidding. In fact, let's pull up the map for you. You have the Hezbollah in Lebanon, arguably the most powerful Iranian proxy. You have the Houthis in Yemen, the Liwa Fatemiyun in Syria, the Badr organization in Iraq, and of course the Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. These groups are all backed by Iran, and they could very well enter the fight. In fact, the Hezbollah has already signaled willingness. They've exchanged gunfire with Israel. They've also fired rockets at Israeli positions. Take a look at this video. It was released by Hezbollah. It shows them destroying surveillance cameras along the Israel-Lebanon border, and Hezbollah is not Hamas. They have more firepower and they have more men, which means Israel cannot take them lightly. But the Hezbollah will not act alone. Like Hamas, they will need the green light from Iran. So the question is, does Iran have the appetite for war? If you ask their leaders, always. But the reality is quite different. Iran's inflation is almost 47%. Unemployment is close to 8%. Their economy has been crippled by Western sanctions, so Iran may not want a direct war. Not unless they get support from allies like China. Plus, direct Iranian involvement could draw the US in, and Washington has some serious firepower in West Asia. Iran will think twice before taking on that. So while a proxy war is possible, a direct war looks unlikely. It's also never happened before. For all this talk, for all this enmity, Israel and Iran have never fought a direct war. And fighting one now makes little sense. Let me explain why I say this. Assume that Iran was behind the Hamas attack, or at the very least they supported it. Then their political objectives have already been met. The Saudi-Israel normalization has been paused. Israeli intelligence has been shamed. Benjamin Netanyahu will likely step down after the war, and the Abraham Accords have been discredited. So as far as Iran is concerned, its mission accomplished. Anything beyond this would be a bonus, but a bonus that comes with a lot of risk. So Iran is mixing the rhetoric with some reason. Their foreign minister says Iran is not looking to expand the war, but that restraint cannot be one-sided.
Of course, the Americans send messages to us. Their message to Iran included calls for implementing restraint and not expanding the war. We respond to the Americans that we are not looking for an expansion of the war, but having restraint cannot be one-sided.
So a lot depends on Israel's Gaza operation. If it's a bloodbath, Iranian proxies could intervene. The Americans are also wary of this. They're yet to blame Iran for the Hamas terror attack. Remember, US media reports have blamed Iran, but the US government says there is no proof. So wider war is not inevitable. There is still time and ways to avoid it. What we need is rational leadership. Amid this talk of escalation, there's one set of people who are living in agony, the families of hostages. The Hamas took many people captive, 199 according to the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. There is little news of them except for the odd video that Hamas chooses to release. And here's the latest one. The video of an Israeli-French woman being held by Hamas. Take a look at this one.
היי, אני מי-השם, כרגע אני נמצאת בעזה, אני מבקשת שיחזירו אותי הביתה כמה שיותר מהר, למשפחה שלי, להורים שלי, לאחים שלי. בבקשה תוציאו אותנו מפה כמה שיותר מהר, בבקשה, תודה.
That was Mia Shem, a 21-year-old Israeli-French woman. She went to the Supernova Music Festival in Reim on the 7th of October, the same festival that was targeted by Hamas. All she wanted to do was have some fun. But she has been taken hostage by Hamas, and now they've released a video of her, the video that you just saw. It's a little over 1 minute long. It shows Mia lying down with bandages on her arm, and it shows someone bandaging her wounds. Mia says she's being taken care of, but she wants to return home as soon as possible. After the video came out, her family held a press conference in Tel Aviv. They called for her immediate release. France too has slammed the video, calling it staged.
I saw my baby on television. I saw she's alive. I saw that she was. I heard before rumors that she was shot in the shoulder or in the leg. So I can see she was shot in her shoulder. I see she had an operation. She looks very terrified. She looks like she's in big pain. And I can see that she's saying what they tell her to say, but I can see that she's stable. I can see she needs medical care. I didn't know she's dead or alive until yesterday. All I knew is that she might be kidnapped. I'm begging the world to bring my baby back home.
Here to say one thing and one thing only. We want Mia and all the other hostages that are captured in Gaza Strip to bring them back home. That's all the reason we are here. Mia is an innocent child that just went to go to a party with her friends and end up kidnapped and being away from home.
Mia is one of the many hostages being held in Gaza right now. And how many are there? The Hamas says they have some 250 people, but the Israeli Defense Forces say there are 199 hostages, many unaccounted for. Israeli officials have not provided specific details. There are a number of foreign and dual nationals in this list. America says 13 of its citizens are unaccounted for, but it's not clear how many of these are being held hostage. Other nations too are looking at captives. Most of the hostages are children and older people. They are from Israel's border towns, the towns that Hamas attacked first. Some of them are from the music festival in Reim, youngsters who went there to have a good time. Volunteers in Israel have set up a war room to identify these people. They're relying on what they do best, technology. Civilians are using artificial intelligence. They're scanning through surveillance footage, trying to identify the hostages.
We have different desks here, and we have teams that are working on technology, cutting-edge technology like AI, like facial recognition, voice recognition, trying to match patterns of movements and all the stuff. On the other hand, we have people who are on social networks. What they do is basically they are the eyes on social networks of different movies, different photos that are relevant to the hostages.
All of these hostages are currently in Gaza. Hamas claims that they're in safe places like the tunnels under Gaza. which leaves Israel with a difficult situation. They want to launch a ground offensive, they want to intensify their attacks, but they also have to think about the hostages. They don't want to endanger their lives. The people of Israel are building pressure, protesting on the streets and slamming Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his failure to protect Israeli citizens.
We have to admit honestly, painfully, and with a bowed head, we, the state leadership and the security establishment, have failed in maintaining the security of our citizens. We failed to implement the unwritten contract, the first of its kind between a state and its citizens.
So what happens next? Hamas want to use the hostages as a bargaining chip. They are already, in fact, talking about it. They want a prisoner swap. They say release Israeli hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. Plus, there is talk about using them as human shields if and when Israel invades Gaza. They'll use the hostages as human shields. As for Israel, it is no stranger to a hostage situation or to prisoner exchanges. In 2006, Hamas captured an Israeli soldier. They held him for 5 years. He was released in exchange for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. So Israel is in a catch-22 situation right now. An armed rescue operation or an intensified attack? What should they do? Both are risky. The other alternative is a compromise, a prisoner exchange. But right now, Israel seems in no mood for a compromise. Vantage continues after a short break.
When sirens go off, people here know to go into the shelters. Because it was a holiday, people were supposed to be walking, to synagogues that morning, and it's a Saturday. But because of the sirens, people weren't on the streets, thankfully. Because the minute that happened, we had a few jeeps. I do not know if it was 3 or 4 jeeps, heavily equipped with military and equipment, guns, explosives, you name it. And they just went through town, through the main street, and then they separated into a few streets. One of them came to the police station that we see the remainings of right here, and they took over the police station, and the rest of them were just going around town and killing anyone that they could. Anyone. People were shot in their cars. There was a minibus here with people that were going on a trip for the day. They shot all of them, all 13 people in the cars. They were just running around trying to kill people as they go. The minute the police was able to do something, they did. The minute our security team, the minute they heard anything, gunshots, whatever that was, they put their gear on and they went to the streets to actually look for these terrorists and to have some kind of a face-to-face with them so they can finish them off. But it was brutal. They came very prepared. They knew exactly what they were doing. And the minute they got a hold of the police station, they got the higher ground. And there was a sniper or 2 snipers on the top of the building. And they were really killing anybody around you. Now you can see this is a populated area, so people were stuck in their homes.
Elith, how many hours it took the security forces actually before they could take control of the city entirely?
So it took a long time, because you have to understand the army was surprised as well, and the army was fighting the front line of the kibbutzim and the moshavim.
Now let's look at how the world is reacting to all of this, the attack by Hamas and its aftermath. How does the world see this? There are protests in support of both Israelis and Palestinians. And again, we say Palestinians and not Hamas because they are not the same. Hamas is a terrorist organization. It planned and executed the brutal attack on October 7th and then retreated into Gaza to use ordinary Palestinians as human shields. Gazans are collateral damage because of Hamas's actions. And that's what many Palestinian supporters are protesting about. But that's the people on the ground. What about their governments? The Israel-Hamas war has divided the world. There are 3 distinct camps now. First, the West. They firmly back Israel. Second, the nations that condemn Hamas but back Palestinian rights. And third, countries that support Hamas. And there are many of them that support Hamas. Let's tell you about these camps. The Western camp has America and Europe. They support Israel and its right to defend itself. They also do not criticize Netanyahu. They're refraining from doing it. Then the neutral nations, countries like India, they condemn the Hamas attack, but they also advocate for Palestinian rights. They call for a two-state solution, the creation of an independent Palestinian state. And the third group is that of Hamas allies and apologists. Many of these players are in West Asia. The most vocal ones are Iran and Lebanon's Hezbollah group. Also Syria, they're part of what is called the Axis of Resistance. And they could actually join this fight. Then you have the supporters who do not get their hands dirty, like Qatar. Right after the Hamas attack, this was their statement. It came from Qatar's foreign ministry. It said Israel was solely responsible for the attack, and this was reprisal for Israel's violation of Palestinian rights. Not surprising at all. Qatar is the home base of top Hamas leaders. So, of course, they would take this stand. Then come the other nations who refuse to condemn Hamas. Turkey, Egypt, Algeria, and a host of Muslim-majority nations. They focus on the plight of Palestinians in Gaza, but they offer little sympathy for the slain Israelis. This list includes countries as far away as Southeast Asia. We're talking about the likes of Malaysia. Yesterday, the Malaysian Prime Minister spoke up. His name is Anwar Ibrahim. He lashed out at the West. He said that he rejects Western pressure to condemn Hamas and that Malaysia has a relationship with Hamas which will continue. That's not all. The Malaysian Prime Minister said that Hamas had won elections in Gaza, so they are a legitimate government. Of course, he failed to mention the fact that those elections were held in the year 2006, and since then, Hamas has not allowed Gazans to vote, most likely fearing that they would be voted out. Anwar Ibrahim's stance does not reflect the suffering of the Palestinians at the hands of Hamas, and it seems like a lazy take on the entire situation. Then you have South Africa, a historical supporter of the Palestinian cause. Their president, Cyril Ramaphosa, made a speech while wearing a Palestinian scarf on Saturday.
They have been under occupation for almost 75 years. And people under occupation who have been waging a struggle against an oppressive government that has occupied their land, but also a government that has in recent times been dubbed an apartheid state.
Ramaphosa said his government had expressed their condolences for both Israelis and Palestinians, but instead of Hamas, it was Israel that was the object of his ire. Same with Colombia. Their president is Gustavo Petro, and he's been trading barbs with Israel. It started with Petro's reaction on the day after the Hamas attack. He said neo-Nazis want the destruction of the Palestinian people. And he compared the Israeli leadership to Nazis. And since then, he's doubled down. When Israel's defense minister compared the people of Gaza to animals, Petro said, that's what Nazis said about Jewish people. He said it was hate speech and it would lead to another Holocaust. Petro's words have infuriated Israel. Colombia's ambassador to Israel was summoned for a reprimand. Israel has also stopped security exports to Colombia. This public rebuke drew another reaction from Petro. He has now threatened to suspend relations with Israel. And the spat looks like it will escalate. It may not be an isolated case. The ongoing conflict is polarizing the entire world, leading us further down the path of instability. As the conflict and chaos escalates, let's turn our focus on a country that is uniquely placed to bring peace. Tonight we'll talk about Egypt. Egypt has played multiple roles over the decades. From Israel's one-time attacker and home to the ideological parent of Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, to the first Arab nation to recognize Israel and then being a mediator and peace broker, Egypt has done all of it. But today, Egypt is playing another role, almost that of a jailer. Gazans can escape the war if they cross into Egypt, but Egypt refuses to open the doors. Gazans also need humanitarian assistance, and Egypt is at the center of those talks. It will be receiving aid from all over the world. It can send this aid to Gaza through a border crossing, the Rafah crossing. Now, multiple aid convoys are already at Rafah. They've been there for days. They're waiting for permission to enter the Gaza Strip.
We are here at the National Alliance for Development Action to offer our help alongside the trucks. The trucks are carrying aid and the convoy will transport this to our Palestinian brothers. We are currently at Rafah border crossing and we are waiting for the aid to enter to our brothers.
All the aid to Gaza will go through Rafah, but that's only when Egypt allows it to pass. And it seems that's about all that Egypt is willing to do at this point, ferry the aid across. It refuses to take Palestinians out of the line of fire. It doesn't want people from Gaza coming in as refugees. So Egypt has closed the Rafah crossing, and Palestinians are waiting on the other side, pleading with Egypt to let them in.
We come to the border crossing hoping that it will open, but so far there is no information. We plead with the Egyptian government to look at us with compassion because frankly, we are in a very dangerous place. There is shelling all around us, and even if I wanted to return home, I would be risking my life.
It seems almost heartless, Egypt refusing to take in Palestinian refugees. In its defense, Cairo says two things. Number one, it cannot afford to take care of these refugees. And number two, this will hurt the Palestinian cause. If these people leave their land, they'll never be allowed to return. That's what Egypt says, and it refers to the past to make this point. Now, there is some truth to both these arguments. And yet it appears like Egypt is abdicating its responsibility, especially considering its long history with Palestine. Look at Hamas, for instance. In 1973, it emerged from a charitable organization working in the Gaza Strip, the Mujama al-Islamiyah. This charity was involved with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. One of the founders of Hamas was Ahmad Yassin. He also helped set up the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Yassin even attended the Al-Azhar University in Cairo. So the ties between Hamas and Egypt run deep. The same can be said about Egyptian ties with Gaza. Between 1949 and 1967, Cairo ruled over the Gaza Strip. Egypt was a protector of the Palestinians in Gaza until the Six-Day War in 1967. That's when Israel took over the Gaza Strip in 1967. It also captured Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. This happened on the watch of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Then came his successor, Anwar Sadat, and he changed the game. He changed Egypt's relations with Israel. In 1973, Sadat invaded Egypt. He started what is called the Yom Kippur War. 5 years later, he signed a deal with Israel, what is called the Camp David Accords. And for this, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He became the first Muslim Nobel laureate. Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel. This led to a peace treaty in 1979 and eventually to Anwar Sadat's assassination. He brought Egypt closer to the West. And since then, Egypt has played the role of mediator and peacemaker. Now, given all this history, Egypt should be leading the way in talks. But not just talks about aid, also talks about dialing down tensions and helping Gazans. Egypt should be taking the lead, but it seems President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is not keen on this. He has domestic concerns. He has a presidential election coming up in December, and at this point, that is his priority, to get re-elected. But is this the best strategy? Egyptians have deep ties with Palestinians, and a shut border crossing will not change that. What it may change is public sentiment for their government. After all, the sympathy for Palestine runs deep in the Arab world, and the pictures from Gaza do not help any Arab power. What are they doing to help the people of Gaza? Why can't they bring them to safety? These questions will be asked. The war is in Gaza, but a new front has opened thousands of kilometers away in Western colleges. Many student organizations have taken sides. Their statements have raised eyebrows. Like at Harvard, students at Harvard released a statement after the Hamas attack, and guess who they blamed for this? They blamed Israel. The students blamed Israel's past policies for the attack. Elsewhere, we've seen protests. Like at New York's Columbia University, hundreds of students gathered for dueling protests. One group supported Palestine, the other supported Israel. Classes were cancelled after fears of a clash. Jewish students said anti-Semitism was on the rise.
Students who were attacked for speaking Hebrew and for hanging up signs denouncing Hamas. There are people over there who are cheering with Palestinian flags after women were raped and stripped and then taken, their dead corpses paraded through the streets of Gaza.
Now, some of this hatred has been toned down. Like at Harvard, a few of the students who wrote that statement have distanced themselves. Why? Because it's hurting their future. Major donors have asked colleges to condemn the Hamas attack, plus employers are blacklisting these students. Like hedge fund billionaire Bill Ackman, he has asked Howard to release the names of students who supported Hamas. He wants to blacklist them. And the threat clearly worked, because some of the students withdrew their statements. Now, we can debate this tactic all we want to. Is blacklisting students for their opinions a good thing? Or will it further alienate them? US presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy thinks it's a bad idea. He says these students are quote-unquote simple fools. But he also says blacklisting them is not productive. Ramaswamy called it dumb political statements. But what shapes these so-called dumb opinions? It is important to understand that, because supporting Hamas is not just dumb, it's also dangerous. So why are these students doing it? One reason could be the faculty. Your lessons and classes influence your opinions. Let me tell you what happened at Stanford. Again, a storied Western college. A lecturer pulled up Jewish students in an undergraduate class at Stanford. He made them stand in a corner and he then told the class, "This is what Israel does to Palestinians." The same lecturer also called an Israeli student a colonizer. He's been suspended now, but you get an idea of what goes on. The same Stanford is yet to condemn Hamas. Their statement only talks about death and human suffering. Yale University is another example. One of their professors had a controversial take on the Hamas attack. She said, settlers are not civilians. In other words, do not mourn the Israeli victims. They had it coming. Settlers are not civilians. And how did Yale respond to this? They said it's freedom of expression, that the comments represented her personal views. How is that not a problem? We are talking about a professor here, someone who shapes the opinions of an entire generation. Surely her personal views are important. Would Yale do the same if she said 9/11 was fake? I bet the action would be stricter. So the faculty and colleges must take some of the blame, because this is not about rebellious teenagers. This is about wrong ideas, about equating terrorism with resistance. These are two very different things. That doesn't mean colleges should censor students or hurt their career prospects, but they should point them in the right direction. Isn't that the whole point of colleges? Yes, there is debate. Yes, there are conflicting opinions, but there are always guardrails, lines that must never be crossed by students. Surely supporting terrorism falls beyond that line. We have nothing against students supporting Palestine. Some of them have genuine concerns, but also condemn Hamas. In an ideal campus, both would be possible. And there are students doing just that, like this Jewish student in New York pointed out.
Quite frankly, the support from my Muslim friends as well. All of the Muslim people who I know, who I'm close with, have reached out to ask if I'm okay and to see how my family's doing. It's just, when it becomes impersonal, people feel much more comfortable calling for violence, and I think that's not okay.
Sums up the problem. Colleges can be a radical experience for students. You're exposed to freedom, you're exposed to new ideas, and in that rush, you can get carried away. You become militant in your opinions and politics. You fail to hear or understand the other side. Now, most students outgrow this phase. But who knows? Maybe a tiny minority will not. They will continue their pro-Hamas politics into adulthood. And who takes the blame for that? Not these colleges, for sure. Vantage continues after a short break.
Really in Sderot, by the time we got the help and by the time we got a hold of the situation, roughly 36 hours, which is a very long time to be home and scared. I got a lot of calls from people calling me and saying there are gunshots by my window, there are gunshots in the streets, not knowing if it's soldiers or if it's, Hamas. So it was very, very scary.
With the kind of city and the situation, how soon do you think the city can go back to normal? People can come back and they will live.
Listen, I'm not a prophet and I have no idea what the government is planning. I do know one thing, that the mayor of the city is already planning ahead. And they understand that in order for us to be able to recover, the minute the military operation ends, we have to be prepared for our people. And we're going to do anything and everything that we need to in order to do that. So we're raising funds right now to be able to rebuild our homes. There's so many homes that have been hit, about 74 direct hits into people's homes. Some people have nowhere to go back to, right? So We're going to be able to rebuild it. We're going to be able to give them what they need when it comes to mental health professionals that are in town, anything and everything. And right now they're getting ready for that. So the minute we'll know that the operation or the war is over, then we can start with the recovery piece.
A few days.
We don't know. I think everybody's kind of preparing us for at least a month. Yeah.
So thank you, Eric, for talking to
very
us.
much.
And it may take probably few months before situation would go back to normal. And situation has been pretty bad. We have seen all around the city, the blood-soaked streets, houses, they have been left like that, cars burned. Behind me you could see there was a police station that used to be here. And what is left of this police station is all that a small puddle of water and rubbles. Those were removed from the site, just days before. Now the entire city, it looks ghostly. The cars that were attacked and they were actually, totally damaged. People at home shot dead. It was a day of rest. People are not very hopeful about how soon the normalcy will return in the city, but they do hope that probably it will take few weeks or few months before the situation could be as safe and secure that people who have fled from the city would be returning back to their home. Meanwhile, the entire city and the perimeter of the city has been taken over by the Israeli Defense Forces, tanks, artilleries being fired, Israeli jets also flying over Gaza and dropping ammunition or missiles targeting Hamas locations. 2,400 or more than that people in Palestine, in Gaza, they have also been killed. Swiftly shifting towards the humanitarian crisis that is emerging in the Gaza Strip because of the number of casualties that has been going on there, humanitarian crisis that has emerged, food supplies shortage, medical supplies shortage, doctors having been killed, children having been killed. So the gory images of Israeli Israeli tragedy, and that is where the balance of geopolitics remains. We'll have to see whether the Israeli offensive will continue on the Gaza Strip or the diplomacy will take center stage, and there will. We are in Sderot, and this was the place which was worst hit during the 7th October terrorist attack by Hamas people. We were joined by Erith and
Meanwhile, the war in West Asia has put Europe on high alert. Last night, a gunman killed 2 Swedes in Brussels, the capital of Belgium. The man is suspected to have extremist motives. Now, both Sweden and Brussels are on high alert. Then you have France. Their President Emmanuel Macron has said, and I'm quoting, "Europe has been shaken." A few days ago, a teacher in France was stabbed to death. The killer had a record of Islamic radicalization, and since then, France too has been on its highest terror alert. And now Macron wants to carry out a review. He wants to identify foreigners with a record of radicalism and to determine who can be expelled from the country. Our next report tells you more.
Last night, Belgium and Sweden were playing a much-awaited football match. It was being held in Brussels, the capital of Belgium, but it was abruptly abandoned. 35,000 fans were stuck inside the stadium for several hours. Why? Because about 5 kilometers away, a man had opened fire. The gunman was in Belgium illegally. He was of Tunisian origin. He was seen getting off a scooter near a cafe. Armed with an assault rifle, he attacked people inside. He targeted Swedish football fans who were in town. Now, 2 Swedes have died and a 3rd person has been injured.
I live nearby and I'm staggered to find out that this happened right here.
Well, now I'm actually starting to feel a bit more threatened since, as I understand, these people didn't have anything to do with any of... they were just normal Swedes watching a football game.
The gunman identified himself as a member of the Islamic State. After the stunning viciousness, he simply got back on his scooter and sped off, leading to an overnight manhunt, which ended today after he was shot dead by the police. Now, Brussels is on its highest terror alert.
Terrorists have to understand that they will never succeed in this mission. They will never subdue our free society. With their hate and violence, they show above all their powerlessness. Terrorism will never beat us.
Sweden too has raised its terror alert to the second highest level. But is raising terror alert levels enough?
This awful terrorist attack that happened yesterday in Brussels. It only shows that the Europeans, we need to step up our security. And defense is part of our security.
Since the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war, the threat of hate crimes has been looming large. Across the UK, US, France, Germany, Australia and other countries, such incidents have seen an uptick. The US had heightened its security weeks ago, yet this weekend, a 6-year-old Palestinian boy was stabbed to death. He was stabbed 26 times. A similar thing happened with France as well. Despite increased security, last week, a teacher was brutally murdered by a former student. The killer had a record of Islamic radicalization. Now, France has been on its highest terror alert since, but it wants to do more. The French administration is to carry out a review. This is to determine the number of foreigners with a record of radicalism and who among them can be expelled from the country. Some critics have called this plan short-sighted. They say it could stigmatize a particular community. This comes at a time when anti-Semitic incidents fueled by neo-Nazis and white supremacists have also seen a rise. Last week, France recorded over 100 anti-Semitic incidents. For the whole of last year, the number stood at 436. More than 2,000 cases of anti-Semitic speech were reported last week. But how much can pondering over dossiers help France? The Israel-Hamas war rages on. There is no end in sight, at least for now. But the West is hoping it can put the brakes on this wave of war-fueled hate crimes.
On the other side of the world, China is throwing a big party. Its Belt and Road Initiative is turning 10, and like any excited parent, China is leaving no stone unturned to celebrate the occasion. Not even a war can dampen its spirits, it seems. The chief guest has already arrived in China. I'm talking about Russian President Vladimir Putin. He reached Beijing this morning and he got a grand welcome. Tomorrow he will sit down with the Chinese president for talks.
President Putin arrived in Beijing this morning and will be invited by President Xi to attend the third Belt and Road Summit Forum for the international cooperation and to participate in related activities. The two heads of state will meet and have an in-depth exchange of views on bilateral relations and issues of common concern.
Putin has barely traveled outside Central Asia since the war, but he did come all the way to China. Shows you the extent of their no-limits friendship between the two countries. That said, this visit has a lot of purpose. The first, of course, is symbolism. China and Russia call themselves close friends. This phase of the friendship was forged in 2013. Their leaders have many similarities. Both were born just months apart. Both were affected by the fall of the Soviet Union. For Putin, it was a personal disaster. For Xi Jinping, it was a cautionary tale. Both rule with an iron fist. So they do have a lot in common, and that has contributed to their blossoming friendship. Xi Jinping calls Putin his best friend, and Putin agrees.
Chairman Xi Jinping calls me his friend, and I call him my friend. We have a popular saying, tell me who your friend is, and I'll tell you who are you. That's how the saying goes. So, if I start praising President Xi Jinping, I would have the awkward feeling that I am lauding praise on myself. This is why I will try to be objective.
So it's a long friendship forged in their love for vodka shots and their hate for the West. Plus, the Ukraine war has brought them closer. China portrays itself as a neutral player, as a neutral party, but supports Russia in more ways than one. China is Russia's largest trading partner. Last year, trade between the two nations reached a record $190 billion. Basically, for Moscow, Beijing is an economic lifeline. Meanwhile, for China, Russia is a major source of oil and gas. Moscow also aims to build a second natural gas pipeline to China. which is why heads of Russia's oil and gas giants Rosneft and Gazprom are in Beijing too. They're part of Putin's traveling delegation. That said, Putin's visit is more about political support and less about securing big-ticket deals. But while the two leaders celebrate BRI and strengthen ties, the Israel-Hamas war will also be high on the agenda. Putin has spoken to multiple leaders in the region. Beijing has dispatched its special envoy to West Asia. Both sides are tracking the developments closely. On Monday, Russia drafted a UN Security Council resolution. It called for a ceasefire in Gaza, but it failed to secure the votes, so it was rejected. Doesn't mean Moscow will give up. Both Putin and Xi Jinping are eyeing the role of peacemaker, and it looks like they will try to pick up the baton soon. Now let's talk about another battle. This one was fought in Indian courts. It lasted a decade, and the result was this. India's Supreme Court struck down a colonial-era law. It decriminalized same-sex relationships. This was 5 years ago. Today, dozens of activists and members of the queer community gathered outside the same court. They were fighting for the right to same-sex marriage, to get access to the same privileges that are extended to heterosexual couples. But they were disappointed. The top court declined to legally recognize same-sex unions. It passed the buck to the government. It said this is an issue that should be decided by the Indian Parliament. But when will that happen, if it happens at all? When will India take the final call? Here's a report.
Former colonial rulers, the British, devastated India. They impoverished India and benefited from it. Now the British may be gone, but India continues to battle its colonial legacy. The same applied to a law the British passed in 1860. It criminalized same-sex intercourse. Marriage rights were limited to heterosexual couples. Now, India has been shedding its colonial baggage. Streets and cities have been renamed. A new parliament building has been constructed. And 5 years ago, the Supreme Court granted rights to the queer community. In 2018, after a decade-long battle, the law made by the British was finally scrapped, with India's apex court decriminalizing same-sex intercourse. But for the community, it wasn't enough. Indian law still limits marriage to heterosexual couples, meaning millions of LGBTQIA+ couples in India cannot access the legal benefits attached to matrimony. This includes adoption, insurance, and inheritance. So last year, more than a dozen petitions were filed in the top court, and today the Supreme Court finally spoke. It declined to legally recognize same-sex marriages, calling it an issue to be decided by the Parliament. In other words, passing the buck to the government. And they have good reason to do this. Marriage is not a fundamental right. It's an evolving institution. So the Parliament brings in laws to reflect the changes, not the court. The role of a court lies in upholding the law.
Some people try to spoil the atmosphere of Indian system, but I am happy that Supreme Court of India has accepted the version of the Government of India, in which it was argued that the court has no power to give this right of same-sex marriage. It is the only right of the Indian Parliament. Today it has been accepted by Honorable Supreme Court.
While for some the verdict is disappointing,
we have been fighting for long and will keep doing so. There has been nothing substantial regarding adoption also. What the CJI said regarding adoption was very good, but it's disappointing that other justices didn't agree. This is a democracy, but we are denying basic rights to our own citizens.
Others have welcomed it.
Although while we were aiming to get an amendment in the Special Marriage Act, that has not happened, but the good thing is that our partnership, a gay or a lesbian partnership, same-sex partnership, is now a recognized civil union.
Especially as the ruling emphasized the rights of the LGBTQIA+ community, demanding the formation of a high-powered committee that would evaluate laws that indirectly discriminate against queer people. Laws that deny them social welfare entitlements or the benefits that usually come with being legally married. According to a survey held in India, 53% of people believe that homosexuality should be accepted. That's a 38% increase from 2014. So Indian society has become more accepting of the LGBTQIA+ community. It celebrates gay prides in cities across the country. But the government has opposed calls to legalize same-sex unions. They say it's incompatible with the Indian family unit concept of a husband, a wife, and children. The issue remains highly divisive in India, so the government must walk a tightrope. Many say the ambiguity makes matters worse. With the Supreme Court not taking a decision on the matter, the ball is now in the government's court.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. In Tel Aviv, an Israeli spokesperson's live broadcast was interrupted by a rocket alert. He was seen evacuating the studio. In Gaza, ice cream trucks have turned into morgues as the death toll mounts. And the UN Security Council made a faux pas while announcing a draft resolution. It said that Israel was one of the countries backing them. Finally, we are taking you back in history. On this day in 1973, oil cartel OPEC announced an embargo on oil exports. It cut exports to the US and other countries that were giving military aid to Israel during the Yom Kippur War. This led to oil prices soaring to unprecedented levels. We're leaving you on that note. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
In world history, the worst terror attack after 9/11, and Israel has decided that that terrorist regime, Hamas, can no longer exist. What happened on the 7th of October, the brutal invasion, the beheading, the burning, the butchering of our people, is the worst case scenario that we cannot live with. And after we destroy Hamas, after we topple it, we expect to work together with international partners so that the reality that will exist inside the Gaza Strip is one in which no terrorist organization is able. I'm afraid we're in the middle of a rocket siren now, and I have to evacuate the studio. My apologies.
Members of the Council have before them document S/2023/772 submitted by Bahrain, Bangladesh, Belarus, Djibouti, Egypt, Eritrea, Indonesia, Israel, I shall correct myself. Israel is not part of that list.
Welcome. You're watching Breaking on CNN News 18. I am Akanksha Swaroop. We dive into the segment with some important breaking inputs coming in from the LOC. We're learning that 2 BSF jawans have been injured in a sniper fire from Pakistan Rangers when they were fixing light on the electricity pole near the Indo-Pakistan border in Pura sector. They have now been rushed to the hospital. We are also learning that troops on the international border Jammu sector have been